Dear learners, today let us learn about the Reformation of the Western Church. Before we go into the detail, let us understand what the Reformation meant. The Reformation of the Western Church was the most important political movement of the 16th century. It effected a schism within Western Christianity and altered the political history of Europe. It is believed that Martin Luther's defiant act of posting 95 theses on the doorpost of a church in 1517 ushered in Reformation. The leaders of the movement were called Reformers, and their followers were dubbed the Protestants. The Reformers objected to the doctrines, rituals, and ecclesiastical structures of the Roman Catholic Church and created national Protestant churches in Europe. The Catholic Church, in order to counter the Reformation, initiated the Counter-Reformation to bring back people into its fold. The Reformation had a huge impact on the political and literary history of England and led to the establishment of the Anglican Church. Let us examine the Western Church before the Reformation. The Western Church, which was the most dominant church in the world, was under the control of the Pope. The Reformation was not the first schism to have occurred in the Western Christian Church. The Catholic Church itself was formed as a result of an earlier schism. It was institutionalized during the 4th century. Within a span of a century, the Rome-based Catholic Church, hence called the Roman Catholic Church, superseded the Eastern Orthodox churches, which were founded around Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem, and emerged as the most dominant church. Since its inception, the Catholic Church attempted to portray itself as the most authentic church, one true church which was divinely founded by Jesus Christ. It advocated that its bishops are successors of Christ's apostles. The Catholic Church retrospectively appointed Peter, the earliest disciple of Jesus Christ, as its first pope. It claimed that popes were spiritual successors of Saint Peter. Since the 4th century, the Pope emerged as the new power center of Europe. During the Dark Ages, from 4th century AD to 14th century AD, the office of the Pope was the most powerful institution in Europe. The Church could collect taxes and could intervene in political affairs. At the village and town levels, the Catholic parishes and monasteries owned most of the land. In order to appease the Church, most rulers in Europe collected additional taxes and sent them to Rome. The Church used this wealth for constructing churches, establishing monasteries, and for financing the crusades. The Catholic Church deemed that since the committal of the original sin, man was a fallen object. The Church argued that man was incapable of even praying directly to God. Hence, the Church advocated that there was a need for an intercession between men and God. In the corporeal world, the priests were the intermediaries between God and men. In the heaven, the saints were expected to intercede with God. Since the priest was God's representative on the earth, the position of the priest was exalted. The Church, drawing on the preaching of St. Paul, forbade the clergy from marrying. The Church emphasized on numerous rituals which were not included in the Bible, which included prayers to the dead, deification and worship of Mother Mary and other saints. The rise and spread of Catholic Church coincided with the Dark Ages. Illiteracy, the unavailability of print technology ensured that Bible was inaccessible to most Christians. The unavailability of Bible meant that practices varied from parish to parish. Even superstitions were a part of Christian life. The Church was hegemonic, repressive, and did not tolerate dissent. The Church advocated penance as a means of gaining God's forgiveness. Since the priest was the final authority in the spiritual affairs, he could levy fines in lieu of sins. By the 14th century, it was common for Christians to seek God's forgiveness by contributing money to the Church. By the 15th century, the sale of deeds for atonement of sins became the Church's major financial source. The sale of deeds was the primary inspiration behind the Reformation. The Reformation of the Church was the most influential political change in the 16th century Europe. It almost coincided with Renaissance. Like the Renaissance, the Reformation marked the end of the medieval era. While the foundational basis for Renaissance was humanism, the Reformation was based on biblical Christianity. The Reformation brought a major schism within Western Christianity. Martin Luther was the most influential protagonist of the movement. Martin Luther's act of nailing 95 theses to the Wittenberg church door in 1517 is said to have brought in Reformation. Those who protested against the doctrines, rituals and structure of the church were called the Reformers. The Reformers disagreed with the existing Catholic Church on three principles. Firstly, they advocated that man is saved through faith in God alone. They argued that neither good deeds nor repentance would guarantee salvation. Salvation, the Reformers argued, was a gift of God. Man, the Reformers stated, is saved through God's grace alone. Men could neither buy forgiveness nor salvation through penance or through church subscriptions. Secondly, the Reformers argued that any church practice which is not prescribed in the Bible is unnecessary. Thus, mystical rituals, worship of Mary, invocation of saints and prayers to dead were deemed deviatory practices. Instead, the Reformers argued for worship services which were in agreement with the Bible. Thirdly, the Reformers argued that priests and even the Pope were mere professionals who performed their duties of conducting worship services. Hence, the priests need not enjoy special reverence. Each man, the Reformers said, could pray for himself and could save himself through his faith. The movement was popular as it gave more power to the laity. While it promised hope to ordinary people who were burdened by the practices of the church, for the rulers, the Reformation meant escaping the authority of the Pope. Millions of Christians left the Catholic Church. Lutheranism, Calvinism, Anglicanism and Puritanism emerged as the new forms of Christianity. Many kingdoms in Northern and Central Europe created national Protestant churches. Due to the Reformation, Rome lost its political clout in Europe. Thus, Reformation brought in a major political shift. In a bid to repair the damage, the Catholic Church initiated the Counter-Reformation in 1545. Also called the Catholic Revival, the movement was organized till the middle of the 17th century. The Counter-Reformation was successful in France, Netherlands and Southern Europe as many Protestants returned to the Catholic Church. However, the movement failed in most parts of Northern, Western and Central Europe. The Reformation coincided with Renaissance. The Renaissance signaled the end of the Dark Ages and ushered in the spirit of scientific inquiry. The inventions of techniques of printing, discovery of trade routes and engagement with Turks since the 13th century resulted in the dissemination of new ideas. The engagement with the Turks resulted in the rediscovery of ancient Greek texts. The Church encouraged the scholars to re-engage with Greek Christian texts and the Greek New Testament. The monks and priests were sponsored to translate and preserve many of the antique texts. The intellectual engagement was instrumental in the establishment of the Protestant Reformation. The prevailing economic and political conditions were also congenial towards the Reformation. Till the beginning of the 16th century, feudalism was the most dominant economic system of Europe. The serfs, the peasants, the artisans and the traders who were emerging as a new class had to serve two masters, the ruling classes and the Catholic Church. European rulers paid a part of the taxes they collected as subscriptions towards the Catholic Church. Thus, the clergy of the Church was living off the labor of the common folk. In addition, the priests began to impose fines on people as atonement for the sins they committed. Members who refused to pay for their sins were deemed heretics. The commoners often witnessed the clergy live in comfortable monasteries. Hence, the ordinary people were waiting for a chance to get rid of the papal yoke. The Black Plague of the 14th century shook the faith of people in the Catholic Church. The Black Plague or the Black Death killed nearly 75% of European population. The Church, which enjoyed predominance over the medical staff as well, was in no position to comfort the population. In the book The Black Death, Rosemary Rock states that the French doctors, in a report submitted to the king, stated that a conjunction of 3 planets, which was designed by the god, created the pestilence in the air. The survivors of the Black Death assumed that the end of the world was near and chose to live as they pleased. As Boccaccio illustrated in his introduction to the Decameron, witnessing the large-scale death of people on a daily basis created a general mode of morbidity and influenced men and women to live for the moment. People adopted hedonistic lifestyles. People's belief in religion was shaken as they realized that the clergy was incapable of interceding and controlling the epidemic. By the middle of the 15th century, print technology was discovered. By 1450, printing presses were established in over 200 European towns. The printing press proved to be very effective in distribution of the Bible and in the dissemination of the ideas of the reformers. Louis W. Alborn, in Printing and the Growth of Protestant Movement in Germany from 1517 to 1524, points out that Luther's movement, unlike the earlier attempts of Huss in the 15th century, was successful only due to the large-scale availability of print technology. Thus, by the time Luther wrote his thesis, the Renaissance, the Black Plague, the economic exploitation by the Church, the invention of the printing press, and the reforms attempted by Wycliffe and Huss created conditions which were ripe for the Reformation of the Church. Now, let us examine Martin Luther's role in the Reformation of the Church. Martin Luther, a German monk, was born in the month of November in 1483. He was a professor of theology and was the most efficient protagonist of the Reformation movement. Martin Luther was not the first priest to have advocated the need for reforming the Church. His efforts were preceded by those of St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, John Wycliffe, and Jan Hus. Luther was a master of rhetoric and was able to articulate his positions in vernacular languages. Martin Luther had the ability to make political alliances with different conflicting political groups at the same time. Finally, he made exemplary use of technology to ensure that his ideas disseminated effectively. Luther was a monk of the Augustine order when he strongly protested against the sale of deeds for the atonement of sins. He disputed the claim that freedom from God's punishment for sins committed could be bought. In 1517, he publicly confronted Johann Tetzel, who was authorized by the Pope to sell the deeds, which was to raise money for the rebuilding of the Basilica of St. Peter at Rome. Luther wrote his thesis protesting against the practices of the Church. The document is supposed to be one of the most influential tracts of the 16th century and was written in Latin. The document adopted a populist tone and critiqued the practices. One of the questions that Luther raised included, why does the Pope, whose wealth today is greater than the wealth of the richest crassus, build the basilica of St. Peter with the money of poor believers rather than with his own money. Luther's friends translated the thesis into German and printed it and circulated it across the German-speaking areas. The debate over Luther's thesis raged for 3 years. In 1520, Luther was issued a papal bull which asked him to justify his actions. Instead of obliging the church, Luther wrote 3 other influential texts: Address to the Christian Nobility of a German Nation, on the Babylonian Captivity of the Church, and on the Freedom of a Christian. In these 3 treatises, Luther raised fundamental questions. The tracts were written in Latin and were translated into German. They were printed and distributed across Northern Europe. The treatises were instrumental in the population revolting against the church. The final treatise on the freedom of a Christian was a mock heroic address to the Pope. On completion of these treatises, Luther publicly burned the papal bull and justified his actions in why the Pope and his recent book are burned and accessions concerning all articles. In 1521, Luther was excommunicated, and Luther is supposed to have said, "I cannot and will not recant anything, since it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. Here I stand, I can do no other. May God help me." The Diet of Worms found Luther guilty and declared him an outlaw. Luther's friends, including Frederick III, protected him. Luther urged the priests and nuns to renounce the vows of celibacy and marry. Despite Luther's activism amongst the peasants and his views on celibacy, he is considered a conservative amongst the reformers. In 1521, he was instrumental in quelling down the Zwickau rebellion. He justified his actions in the treatise, a sincere admonition by Martin Luther to all Christians to guard against insurrection and rebellion. Even as he worked with the poor, Luther also aligned closely with the electorates and the kings. The new church which Luther founded differed radically from the Catholic Church. The laity controlled the church, the clergy were mere professionals, and every man could interpret the scripture. However, since the new church was short of funds, the German states began to fund the church. The Reformation ensured that the arrangement where the religious institutions could wield absolute political power over the state was dismantled. In Germany, due to Luther's efforts, the arrangement was replaced by another structure. The state began to act as the guardian and the patron of the church. Most of the states in Northern Europe and England adopted such an arrangement. Now, let us examine the role of other prominent personalities in the Reformation of the Church. The first, let us consider John Wycliffe, an Englishman born in 1320 in Yorkshire. Wycliffe was an English scholastic professor, theologian, and a translator who attempted to translate the Bible into English. Its translation is called the Wycliffe Bible. A noted professor at Oxford, Wycliffe used his position, wealth, and time to engage in debates over the church. Wycliffe is called the morning star of the Reformation, since his postulates over the functioning of the church became the guiding tenets of Reformation. Wycliffe argued that the Bible should be made available in vernacular languages. Wycliffe spoke against the rituals that did not have biblical sanctions. Wycliffe argued that salvation is guaranteed by God's grace alone. Wycliffe was also critical of the wealth that the church possessed and argued that it should distribute its wealth and become a poor institution. Wycliffe stressed that the church should learn piety from the first church that the apostles formed. Wycliffe's sermons were popular amongst the public. His ideology was termed Lollardism, and it attracted the attention of powerful people. In turn, these powerful people saved Wycliffe from the church's wrath. The second important personality of the Reformation was Jan Hus, who was born in 1369 in the Kingdom of Bohemia. Hus was a philosopher who taught at Charles University at Prague. He rigorously advocated the need to reform the church. His followers were termed Hussites. His arguments were in accordance with Wycliffe. Hus argued that every man had the freedom to preach the word of God. He stressed that the laity had the right to participate in both the forms of Eucharist, that is, to consume both the bread and the wine. The clergy, Hus argued, should not interfere in the affairs of the state. The priests and the laity, Hus argued, should be governed under the same secular law. Hus was instrumental in the creation of a Czech nationalism. He is considered a national hero, and his efforts were viewed as a political project that sought to emancipate the Czechs from the authority of the Pope. In 1415, the church excommunicated Hus, branded him a heretic, and burnt him alive. Hussites fought the Holy Roman Empire and successfully converted the Czech population into Protestants. Rome organized 5 unsuccessful crusades against Hussites. By the end of the 16th century, over 90% of Czech population were members of the non-Catholic churches that Hussites organized. The teachings of Hus were used by Luther and Calvin in the 16th century. The third most important personality of Reformation is John Calvin, a Frenchman who was born in 1509. Calvin was a theologian and a pastor during Reformation. He is regarded as the second most influential 16th century reformer of the church. Calvin emerged as the radical face of the Reformation and is considered the father of the Puritan churches. Calvin began to reform the church in France before he fled to Switzerland. In Switzerland, Calvin formed the church in Geneva. While Calvin agreed with Luther on the need for and the nature of the Reformation, they differed on theological issues. Calvin rejected Luther's notion of single predestination, that is, God chooses whom he would give salvation to. Calvin argued that man's fate is predestined by God. Hence, for Calvin, God also decides whom he would damn. Calvin argued that since man was created to glorify God, despite salvation being independent of human needs, it was imperative that men had to be good. Calvin's followers were deemed Calvinists and Puritans, and his doctrine was called Calvinism. Since the 14th century, religious issues influenced the political and social conditions of England. The 14th century, England witnessed Wycliffe-inspired Lollardism. The 16th century, England witnessed fracas over the Reformation, which led to the creation of the Anglican Church. Debates continued even after the creation of the Anglican Church. In the 16th century, due to Martin Luther's influence, despite a minority which was devoted to the Catholic Church, the nation began to embrace the change in the form and nature of the Church. The masses, inspired by the Reformation, called for a radical revolution. However, influential men, including the Oxford group, hoped for a gradual and peaceful religious reform. The actual catalysts for the reformation of the Church in England were the personal and political projects of Henry VIII. Till the end of 1520s, King Henry adopted a conservative attitude towards Reformation. He attacked Luther in a pamphlet which impressed the Pope. The Pope granted Henry the title Defender of Faith. However, when Henry, in a quest to marry Anne Boleyn, demanded that his marriage with Catherine of Spain be annulled, Pope refused to dissolve the marriage. An affronted Henry rejected the papal authority over England and declared himself the supreme head of the Church in England. Henry's act was criticized by humanists, including Sir Thomas More. Thus, it was Henry's personal issues that led to the creation of a separate English church called the Anglican Church. Edward VI, who was the son of Henry, in his reign made the separation decisive. The English Church derived its ideology from the Reformation. However, post the reign of Edward VI, Mary, who was the sister of Edward VI and the daughter of Henry, restored Catholicism. Protestants were burnt as heretics. But as Elizabeth, the last of Henry's children, came to the throne in 1558, she signaled the final victory of the English Church. Puritans, who were radical Protestants, emerged as a potent force in England. Influenced by Calvin and John Knox, they relentlessly campaigned for the creation of a Protestant church. Elizabeth skillfully managed to retain the Puritans within the fold of the Anglican Church. The Puritans argued for simpler practices. In congregations which were controlled by the Puritans, they erased all the rituals. By the turn of the century, Puritans separated themselves from the state church and established various sectarian bodies. Shortly after 1600, the Independents or the Congregationalists among the Puritans migrated to Netherlands and founded the Puritanical Church, which in the 17th century colonized New England. During the reign of James I, the breach between the Anglicans and the Puritans widened. The nation was divided into two hostile camps, and such a division proved decisive to the development of English literature. During the Civil War, most of the Puritans sided with Cromwell's Parliamentarians, while the Anglicans sided with the Royalists. The writers were also organized on the lines of their faith, though such an organization had more to do with the public policies of the churches. Since the Puritans advocated banning of theatre on the grounds that they were promoting infidelity and paganism, most of the playwrights sided with the Anglicans. Prominent writers, including John Milton and John Bunyan, were Puritans. John Donne was a part of the Anglican clergy. Some, like John Dryden, often shifted their religious allegiance. On assuming power, Oliver Cromwell executed the king and shut down the theatres. On the death of Cromwell and on the restoration of the monarchy, the theatres were reopened. The period between 1660 and 1700 witnessed an increase in the number of playwrights who, probably in retaliation against the Puritan ban, produced decadent plays. The public, which was deprived of entertainment for long, thronged the theatres and consumed these plays. The Reformation had far-reaching ramifications on the subsequent political and literary history of England. Towards the end of the 17th century, England witnessed the emergence of the Tory and the Whig, that is, the conservative and the liberal, as competing political factions. The political division was initiated by Cromwell's intervention, which was in turn influenced by the social changes that were brought by the Reformation. Dear learners, We have just concluded the lesson, The Reformation of the Western Church. Hope you enjoyed the lesson and see you in the next class. Thank you.